Hello and welcome to Good Evening Britain, a Force for Good's weekly show coming to you live from our studios here in the heart of the great British city of Glasgow, with me, your host, Alistair McConnachie. We are broadcasting on all our digital platforms throughout the United Kingdom and across the world. We're bringing you quality, pro-UK comment and analysis every Wednesday from 7 until 8 p.m. on Facebook, on YouTube, on X, and on TikTok. Folks, thanks for tuning in. Please do send in your greetings. Tell us where you're watching from on this March evening. And send in your questions and send in your comments. We've got another packed show tonight. And at 7:30, we have got our regular guest, Avellina Balestri, the American historian, author, and singer, who will be speaking around our theme of the Scottish Loyalists in the revolutionary period in America. And tonight we're going to be talking about a Scot who fought in the French Indian War. Avellina will be speaking all about that in her inimitable and engaging way from 7:30 until about 5 to 8. Prior to that, we are going to be looking at the day's news and also the big issue which is always with us these days, which is the mass immigration invasion of our country. And we're going to be looking at what we can do about it. And we've been discovering some amazing stuff that really does need to be better known. It really does. The absolute unbridled generosity, unnecessary generosity of the British state. How can it possibly be explained? We're going to be talking about the things that it offers people who really are not necessarily contributing very much to the state, but have a very easy time of it in a way that really doesn't make any sense. We'll be talking about that in a few moments. Let's say hello to Derek Hart, who is first in tonight. Good evening, Alistair and the AFFG family. Good evening, Derek. And you'll be pleased to see, Derek, we're wearing the blue AFFG t-shirt, which Derek says, why don't you ever wear a blue one? And I thought, well, you know what? We like to keep red as our signature color, but blue is also quite nice from time to time. So we've got the blue AFFG tee, which can be got at a link via our shop. It's our Teespring shop, but you go to aforceforgood.uk/shop-1 and you'll see the link at the top to our t-shirts. Fantastic. Thanks for the people sending in the hearts on TikTok. Exiled Viking says, evening, Mr. Al and the rest of you. Good evening, sir. Hi to Oksana and good evening to Debbie. Hope things are well with you, and to Budgie. Good evening to you. And your profile pic there, is that from the film Metropolis? I don't know. It looks like it. Hi to Catherine. Good evening. Great Britain, she says. And to the rest of the world. Well, that's a big good evening to the rest of the world. Christopher, a wonderful British evening to all. Good, 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 good. Well, where shall we begin tonight? We can begin with this. If you're watching on X, please give us a repost. Please give us a repost, because that really does help get the message out. And if you want to give us a quote post as well, do that. And that means we can also retweet you later this evening or straight away, as it may be. If you're watching on YouTube, please give us a subscribe if you don't already. And on Facebook, please give us a like and share. Let's get the message out. We rely upon you guys for that. And many of you do great work for us in that sense. Budgie Burger says it's from the day the earth stood still. Right. That's not a film I know much about, I have to say. Was that a Doug McClure film? I remember Doug McClure back in the 70s had these ones like Journey to the Center of the Earth and all that kind of stuff. I used to watch them at the local Odeon in Ayr. Quite good fun. Yeah, let's begin at the beginning and let's talk about the number of people crossing the channel. Now, Matt Goodwin, who is a great tour de force on this, he put out a statement the other day on Twitter, and it read, we've got it here, let's just put it up. He said, there we go, as of today, 154,017, mainly young men from Islamic nations, entered Britain illegally on 4,343 boats. This is one of the biggest failures of the British state in history. It cannot stop them coming. It cannot control its own borders. It cannot keep its own people safe. And that got almost 500,000 views. And quite rightly so. And I looked at that and I thought, I wonder how he calculated that, where he got those figures, because these are useful figures to know. And well, would you believe, but actually I'm pleased to say that the British state, in a very unusual demonstration of competency, actually does give us these figures here. And let me just run you through this. This is at a page called Government Small Boat Activity in the English Channel. Okay, so if you were to go to just go to Google and type in small boat activity in the English Channel, data on the number of migrants arriving in the UK in small boats and those who were prevented by French authorities from crossing the English Channel. And what they do is they give it to you, small boat arrivals the last 7 days, a weekly summary, and also an Excel spreadsheet here, which we'll open up in a moment. But let's just go to this one. Small boat arrivals last 7 days. Okay, so this is from the 26th of February. 0 came across, 0 came across on 27th, 0 came across on the 28th. Then on the 1st of March, 68 came over in one boat. And then on the 2nd of March, 592 came over in 11 boats. Then on the 3rd of March, 182 in 3 boats. And yesterday, 4th of March, 326 in 6 boats. So that's the past week. Now, let's go down and let's click on migrants detected crossing the channel in small boats. And this will bring up an Excel spreadsheet, folks, from the very beginning of recorded time, as it were. That is to say, when the British government started to actually calculate this. And let me bring it up. Okay. Migrants detected crossing the English Channel in small boats. And what we've got here at SB01, small boat 1, is the figures every day from the 1st of January 2018 Migrants arrived, boats arrived, right down through the previous 6 years, right down to the bottom here, and it ends last week. They've still to add the last few days, but so from the 1st of January 2018 to the 27th of February 2025, and we'll put the link up to this document after the show in the description box. So let's add up everything in this figure, which is all the migrants. Let's add this up. What's going? Oh yeah, I have to enable editing. Enable editing. Okay, let me bring that up again. And we will go in here to add this up, enable editing, auto sum. 153,194. 153,194 illegals essentially came across from the 1st of January 2018 to the 27th of February 2025. In how many small boats? In 4,328. Let's work that out as an average per boat. $36 per boat, but nevertheless, that's an incredible amount. 153,194. As Matt Goodwin says, an absolute failure of the British state. It cannot control its own borders. It cannot keep its own people safe. Well said. Okay, well, now we know where to find those figures. And we'll put the link up. Don't save. Good. Now, Patrick Christy of GB News, perhaps picking up on that, he actually made a really good point yesterday on this precise matter. And let's hear what he had to say.
If only we put as much effort into defending our own borders as we are when it comes to protecting Ukraine's. Nearly 600 illegal migrants crossed the Channel yesterday, the highest number for a single day this year. 2,716 of them have arrived so far this year. That's 20% more than at the same point last year. What's Home Secretary Yvette Cooper done? Well, agreed to send even more money to the French. In fact, she's extended that deal until 2027. Oh, but it's on one condition, OK? That they build a £12.5 million migrant detention centre in Dunkirk. Yeah, all right then, they were supposed to do that years ago. It's been held up due to planning rows. I mean, this mythical migrant detention centre was part of the 480 million quid Britain agreed to pay for additional border patrols and surveillance equipment, such as drones and night vision binoculars. Why are we even paying for that? Can't the French afford night vision binoculars? You are paying for 730 of the 1,200 French police officers dedicated to patrolling France's northern border. The French, after all these years, have literally only just passed a law to allow police officers to intercept migrant boats in shallow water. So this whole time, they were operating under a law that prevented them from stopping migrant boats in the water, which is why people smugglers have been putting people in boats in rivers that lead into the Channel, because once they get in those boats, in those rivers, they could not be stopped by French authorities. Does that really sound like the French want to do anything about the problem to you? a convenient law that prevented them from stopping any migrants in the water. Their new detention centre, which Brits have already paid for, can't be built because of planning rows. We even paid for night vision cameras on the beaches that the French installed, didn't turn on, and then when they did, only a few of them worked. Under Labour, the number of migrant hotels has risen by at least 7. I just find it a little bit rich that we see scenes like this. You know, a load of European leaders there talking about our values, protecting Europe from invasion, all of this stuff. And literally, whilst that's happening, boatloads of mostly men from the Middle East and Africa are breaking into Britain. Starmer has formed a coalition of the willing to help Ukraine. All right, OK. Well, maybe we actually need a coalition of the willing to prevent Britain from being invaded as well.
Very well said, Patrick. And what really stands out there for me is when he talks about how Britain is always so keen to protect the borders of, it seems, other countries when it can't protect its own borders. Well, if you're a country that can't protect your own borders, you don't really have any right to be going around the world pretending or saying that you're going to protect other countries' borders, because you should be looking after your own country's borders first. And I've been reading quite a bit recently of various commentators talking about how Britain needs to spend more on the military. And, you know, it's one thing to, if you're a sovereign nation, to spend money on the military to defend your own border, to defend your particular interests overseas. And many of us would have no problem with that. But it's quite another thing to let your country go to rack and ruin and then say, but we've got to be spending money to defend other countries. You know, the priorities there are all completely wrong. And there's quite a few of these people now talking about, you know, we need peace can only be established through strength, and we need a historic rearmament of Britain, and we need to drastically increase the size of the armed forces, according to like Alistair Heath here, who's one of the editors of the Daily Telegraph. The question is why? Why? When we can't even defend our own country from men in dinghies, what right do we have to be going around the world acting as the world's policeman? You know, we don't have that luxury anymore. Maybe back in the Victorian age when we had an empire and everything seemed fairly stable at home, then we could have the quote unquote luxury to go off abroad and to like lay down the rules and to be the world's policeman. But quite frankly, we're in absolutely no state to be doing that, nor should we be doing that morally when we can't even defend our own country. So I balk when I hear we need to increase spending on the military. For what? For what? To defend our country is the main reason we should be spending on the military. And if we can't defend our own country, then we should be using that money to defend our own country in whatever way, shape and form is necessary, including beefing up the civilian border force, including beefing up the detention and deportation facilities, including beefing up enforcement. That's where money should be getting spent on, not building an army so we can invade Iran or some nonsense like that, or you know, because China is a threat. What are we going to do if is China going to declare war on us? Are we going to fight China? I'm afraid if that comes to the head, we'll just not bother, quite frankly. Goodness sake, the point is to defend Britain, not to defend the rest of the world. So no more of this, let's spend money on armaments. For what is the first question. And unless it's defending Britain and enforcing Britain's borders, then we shouldn't be spending money on all that kind of stuff. And we need to change the frame here, because if we're not careful, these people are going to lead us into World War III. And, you know, some people will say, oh, the youth will never fight for Britain anymore. That's not correct. The youth will defend Britain if Britain is attacked. The youth is not going to go and fight against Iran or against China or something like that. Of course not, and nor should it. But they will defend our country, and they will support people who want to defend our country. So we have to show that our country is worth defending, basically. Anyway, that's taken me a little bit away from the point that I wanted to say, which is, why are all these people coming here? Now, the reason is because our welfare system is unbelievably generous, unbelievably generous. Now, just to run you through it very quickly, and let's talk about legal immigrants. If you're a legal immigrant and you come over on a work visa or a family visa, then you just need to stick in at your job, which is probably going to be a fairly low paying job, for 5 years. And once you have been here for 5 years, which is a measly amount of time, you can then apply for what's called indefinite leave to remain. And virtually, you'll get it. You'll get indefinite leave to remain. Now, in those 5 years prior, you do not get full access to the welfare system. You do not get access to social housing, and you do not get full access to the NHS. You have to pay for it. You have to pay what's called an NHS surcharge. So you do have to, it's not given to you when you're on a work visa. You do have to make payments and so on and so forth. But once you get indefinite leave to remain after only 5 years, then basically everything opens up to you. You get access to all welfare benefits, such as universal credit, access to all disability benefits, entitlement to social housing, entitlement to housing benefit. You get free and full access to the NHS, including entitlement to student loans and student grants, and you get entitlement to the state pension, and after a certain amount of paying into it, that is, and you're then entitled to bring in non-British family members, particularly spouses and children, although that seems to be increasing in its scope as well. And incredibly, I just learned this today, and I did not know this, and I've had to go back and add it to an article that I've written. But it also means that as soon as you get indefinite leave to remain, if you have any children after that date, they automatically become British citizens, even if you're not a British citizen. Your child, if it's born in this country after you've been given indefinite leave to remain, will automatically become a British citizen. And the ones that were born before you got indefinite leave to remain, the ones who were born in Britain before you got indefinite leave to remain, well, you can just apply for their citizenship. They're not automatic citizens, but you can apply to register them as British citizens. That's unbelievably generous, considering you, as the immigrant, are not even a British citizen. So this is all crazy stuff. It's so much money is suddenly given to these people after they've been here for 5 years. Now, a lady called Madeline Grant wrote this article here. Indefinite leave to remain is wrecking the UK. Somebody sent it to me, and I had to check a bit in it here because I couldn't believe that was correct. And then I discovered it was correct. That was the bit about the children automatically becoming citizens. Let me just bring that article up for you, and we'll just run through it here briefly. Indefinite leave to remain is wrecking the UK. From the Daily Telegraph online on the 25th of February and in the hard copy on the 26th. And she's talking here about the British disease, which she says is naivety. In 2025, the British disease is naivety. Few policies are more symptomatic of this malady than UK policy on indefinite leave to remain. In an object lesson in his claim to be the most thoughtless man in Britain, Boris Johnson liberalised the rules on migration, opening up the country as never before. As a result, annual net migration rose to a high of above 900,000. As we always say, that's the wrong calculation. It's gross migration we should be looking at, and gross migration is about 1.2 to 1.3 million. And here she says what I've just mentioned. Under our current immigration rules, almost all migrants on work and family visas will qualify for ILR status in just 5 years, meaning they and their dependents will also become eligible for a range of additional benefits, social housing, healthcare, state pension, etc. This is the bit I could not believe, and I spent about an hour and a half today checking it. Their children automatically become citizens too if they are born in Britain. Few countries can boast such a clear absence of any social contract to qualify for entitlements. I like that. Few countries can boast such a clear absence of any social contract to qualify for entitlements. The idea of the social contract is that you do things in exchange for the state giving you things, like you get up at 7 o'clock in the morning and you go to work in the belief that at the end of the week, you'll have enough to pay your rent and your council tax and to look after your family and maybe even have enough for a wee holiday once a year. But when that social contract breaks down, when that's no longer possible, then everything falls apart. And immigration, mass immigration, is destroying the social contract because we are basically not caring that the people coming in should qualify in certain ways. We just give them anything. There's no social contract there. And she points out that if left unchecked, it will be a ticking time bomb on the public finances, because there's going to be, in the next few years, all the people who came in on the Boris wave, all the millions of them, are all going to start qualifying for indefinite leave to remain, which means they're all going to start qualifying for these massive levels of benefits, which is likely to cost the state around 234 billion at a conservative estimate, at a very conservative estimate. And the country can't do any of that whatsoever. And she goes on here and points out in another pithy sentence, as few as 5 years of poorly paid work in exchange for a lifetime of costs to us, the taxpayer, is quite simply a terrible deal for us. And she says we must tighten our policy on indefinite leave to remain. And what she suggests here is maybe extending the eligibility period from 5 years to anything upwards of that. And yes, that should certainly be done. Although we at A Force for Good advocate that the concept is abolished entirely and that immigrants do not get any of those additional benefits until such time as they become citizens. And what we advocate is that citizenship is made much harder. Instead of being able to get citizenship after 6 years, you should only get it after 25 years. And we've written a big article on our website about that. So she's looking at the government and she's trying to convince Keir Starmer, and she's pointing out that from a left-wing perspective, the cost implications of unreformed ILR will fall on the poorest through increased competition for social housing, NHS waiting lists, even universal credit. Government might be forced to cut welfare across the board to meet these associated costs. The obvious panic in the PM's voice as he accused Reform UK of blah blah suggests he is at least beginning to grasp the threat. Indeed. So that is the real danger. It's the ILR the indefinite leave to remain, which is really what's bringing in all the legals. Now, as for these people coming across the channel, if they get refugee status, then unlike the people who came in legally, as soon as somebody gets refugee status, they get access to everything. They don't have to wait 5 years. They get access to everything. That's a scandal for another day to talk about. But goodness me, we're writing this book at the moment, volume 2 of One Big Country, and we're looking into this, and we're really asking, how on earth did any of this come about? And it only came about, in my view, because there was a class of lawyers and internationalists in the British state who said, let's just do this. We've got the power, and the stupid people will never find out. And they just worked their will, and not a single British politician either knew what was going on or had the cajones to disagree. And all of this has just been going on since at least 1948. And Edward Heath's 1971 immigration bill brought in indefinite leave to remain. So he's and his lot are to blame for that. But cast your mind back to 1971. Nobody knew what was going on in 1971. Britain was a completely different country. Now, did I hope people saw that. Some people are saying they didn't see that. Oh my. Okay, tell me if that last segment worked. Somebody said it didn't work, that they couldn't see anything. Let's change the subject anyway. Let's go to somebody saying it was all okay for them. 1 or 2 people couldn't see anything. Okay, doesn't matter. We'll get it sorted. Let's go to our guest now, Avellina, who has been with us several times before, an expert in American revolutionary history, especially from the British point of view. Folks, please say hello to Avellina.
Hello, Alistair.
Hi there, Avellina. Yes, I see that you're commemorating Lent. Lent
yes,
today,
yes, I've kitted up for Ash Wednesday, so I have the ashes.
Well, I think people in Britain have forgotten all about Ash Wednesday. The big thing in Britain now is Ramadan, which is apparently when the Muslims don't eat lunch, and the world gets to find out about it.
It's interesting because I was just talking to some Muslim friends about this year is, well, I mean, for the past number of years, in fact, there's been a crossover with Lent and Ramadan, because Ramadan moves, it goes by the lunar calendar. And, you know, Easter also moves. So, I mean, so that our liturgical, we're moving in various concentric directions. But for the past few years, the fasting seasons have kind of overlapped for us. So, you know, we have Lent, of course, as the fasting season for Christians. And yes, Ramadan is, you know, the fasting season for Muslims, and which they will not eat or drink from sunrise to sunset, essentially. When the sun is in the sky, they don't eat or drink. And so that is their tradition with that. And so we have Muslim friends and I do have a kind of teasing with each other. We're like, well, we'll keep each other accountable to try and do the fasting, you know, on our specific fast days, because of course Lent is not as strict nowadays as Ramadan. But back in the day, like in the medieval period, it was much closer to the way Muslims practice Ramadan, in terms of really giving up lots and lots of different types of food, you know, throughout the Lenten season. So it was closer, it was more rigorous. But now we still do have, you know, the fast days, and this is one of the fast days as far as Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. So it's yeah, it's basically supposed to be the idea of fasting both certainly from a Christian point of view, but also Muslims with regards to Ramadan, it is supposed to be like a spiritual purge. So you're kind of training your body to basically go without so that you can focus on the like higher goods and put things into perspective.
Yes, it's I like the idea, and somebody introduced me to the idea of going without a few years ago, and I quite liked the idea. And also, if I was being honest about it, I thought it was a good idea for a diet as well. So I'm actually for the last 3 years, actually, I've cut out alcohol for 40 days and 40 nights.
Oh, really?
And this year, I'm cutting out alcohol and bread. Can you believe
Oh,
it?
really?
That's so.
That's admirable. You see that, and this is something. I mean, this was like a thing again in the Middle Ages. They would cut out leaven, for example, and you still can run into that type of thing with some observations in the Orthodox communities and Eastern Rite traditions. So you're going into Slavic mode.
Yeah.
There you go.
Hoping to drop a few pounds as well. That would be a bonus, because that's really what puts on the beef is alcohol and bread, or the 3 B's as I call it: beer, bakeries, and bread.
Beer, bakeries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway,
No, I could definitely see that.
Yes. Anyway, let's talk about what you're on here tonight about, and that's basically for the 5th installment of what I like to call Scottish Loyalists in the American Revolution, or the American Rebellion, depending which side of that particular conflict you're on. And the people we've looked at previously: Major John Pitcairn, General Simon Fraser, Major Patrick Ferguson, and General Edward Braddock. And tonight we're going to be hearing about General John Forbes. Now, tell us, what period of time are we talking? What's the years here, and what's the geography of this particular man's situation?
So General Forbes is mainly known for his participation in the 7 Years' War, alias the French and Indian War. So it's the same conflict, though in Europe it tends to be called the 7 Years' War. It's the wider theater, whereas the war specifically in North America is called the French and Indian War. So Forbes' story and his participation in that war ties in a lot to the previous gentleman that I discussed, which was General Edward Braddock, because where Braddock failed, Forbes succeeded, essentially, in terms of the campaign both of them embarked upon. One attempt at Braddock's campaign was an attempt to take the French Fort Duquesne, and it failed. And Forbes' expedition was an attempt to take Fort Duquesne, and it succeeded. So they are connected that way. But to begin at the beginning with Forbes, he was born in Dunfermline in Scotland, a very famous area for its connection to King Malcolm and Queen St. Margaret of Scotland and the abbey that was founded there. And he comes from this very prominent family, the Forbes, in terms of politics and law and the military. They're very prominent. He has a lot of prominent relatives who are involved in various facets of Scottish and then British society. He has relatives who were involved in the passing of the Act of Union, for example. He also has relatives who distinguish themselves as agents of the government. They tended to be a pro-government family. In terms of more specific, they tended to be pro-Hanoverian government, like during the Jacobite rebellions and so forth, and they tended to be pro-Union, pro-Whig, prior to that during the reign of Queen Anne and so forth. So Forbes' cousin, so John Forbes' cousin, Duncan Forbes of Culloden, is actually fairly famous as well in his own right, and he could have a whole different episode, but he was, a very famous government agent, legal mind, religious author, a bit of an Enlightenment man, a jack of all trades within the Scottish sphere. So John comes from this very prestigious family. Now, his father dies a few months before he was born, actually, and it comes from a big family, and with quite a few siblings. And at first, his intention is to go into medicine, so he studies medicine in Edinburgh, but then he ends up shifting and instead going into the military. So, as a young man, he goes into the military. He was often in and out of financial difficulties, which was common when you went into the military. At this time, there was struggles in order to pay for your commission, and then all of these basically payments that went into accoutrements and everything else. So he struggled financially quite a bit in his early years, especially. But he ends up in the War of Austrian Succession. So this is basically in the 1740s. It's concentric with the Second Jacobite Rebellion of 1745 is basically going on in conjunction in a lot of ways with the war that was happening, the War of Austrian Succession. And so he ends up in that war in Belgium, fighting, in the British Armed Forces. And he is an aide-de-camp of General James Campbell, another Scot. And Campbell gets mortally wounded in battle when on the continent. And Forbes, his aide, refuses to leave him when the army is forced into retreat. He won't leave his commander, who's badly wounded. And he stays, and he gets captured along with him by the French. And he's pretty quickly exchanged out, although his commander dies, and he is clearly, from his letters, very bereft of his commander. He really cared about him and saw him as a mentoring figure. And it was kind of a moment that does go to show Forbes' character, though, that he has a great sense of loyalty to his commander as an aide, and he was willing to, stay and take whatever risks with him being captured by the enemy. So this is, a moment with him that is quite memorable. And over time, Forbes just progresses with his career in the military in various capacities and in various locations. And eventually it leads up to, where he gets more famous. He has been networking quite a lot. Again, in military circles, he has a lot of different connections. He, like the vast majority of other British officers in the 18th century, is a part of the Freemasons. This was especially common in Scotland. And so he has those kind of military connections that are built off of that association. And so eventually he ends up in the French and Indian War. So this is in the 1750s. So just to scroll back to what I talked about last time, General Braddock's march and the massacre, the Battle of Monongahela, took place in 1755. It was such a disaster that they really didn't, wholeheartedly try again for a number of years until basically they ultimately get it in 58. So there's time that spanned between the two attempts. And so Braddock was in charge of the last one. Forbes is in charge of this one. And Forbes comes into this as he's starting to experience really poor health. It's kind of a bit of an irony, given he was a doctor, or he wasn't a doctor. He was studying medicine, and he wanted to be a doctor. So he ends up dealing with really terrible health, which to this day we're not exactly sure what was wrong with him. Some debate that it could have been stomach cancer or something to that effect, but it took a massive toll on his just energy, sapped his strength, and yet he was out there and he was determined to press on with the campaign. And so he ends up, and this ties into the young George Washington. So from the last episode, I'd mentioned that he was an aide to General Braddock on that Braddock's March, Monongahela experience.
That's right. Just for the benefit of the listeners as well, that was when George Washington was actually on the British side.
Yes.
Rather than later in his career when, of course, circumstances changed to the point where he chose the winning side. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. So this is young George Washington in his 20s. He's very zealously royalist. And he's very eager to attain a British military commission. And this becomes part of his grievance, is that, you know, there were all types of prejudices in the time period based on everything you can think of, ranging from, you know, race to religion to location. You know, it's just the way it is. So he, as a colonial, was in a position where it would be very difficult to get a regular army commission. And he knew that, but he kind of kept hoping that if he made the right connections and sort of befriended the right people and proved himself enough, he could get what he wanted and get this commission and excel the way that he wanted to excel in the British regular force. So in the aftermath, if you recall, with Braddock, Braddock had got him off the bench in the beginning because Washington had basically opened fire on a French ambassadorial delegation. He didn't realize they were ambassadors, but it turned out they were. And then he lost control of his Indian allies, who ended up killing the ambassador, and kind of mayhem unfolded. And he ended up building a fort in a valley called Fort Necessity, which basically got taken down. And it was really, really bad in terms of on his record, and therefore he was put on the bench. And so Braddock basically gives him the opportunity to get off the bench and become his aide. And Braddock actually pushed back on royal governors who didn't want Washington being involved. So Braddock helped get him off the bench. And so then he, of course,
Okay, so Forbes.
So he ends up with, so the whole Braddock thing happens. And so the end of it was that Braddock hadn't listened to Washington, just to recap, about wilderness tactics. And so Washington had a bit of a grind toward Braddock's memory due to this. They had kind of ended on some complicated footing, let's just put it that way. And then later on, Washington goes to Lord Loudon, another figure who is Scottish, and tries to get advancement, essentially, in the aftermath of the Monongahela situation. And Loudon is pretty rude to him. So suffice to say, he's pretty pompous and pretty rude to Washington. So Washington kind of does a walkout, and sort of does I protest, I walk out, I'm not going to be involved. Like, I'm going to quit the army, essentially. Even the colonial position he had in the colonial militias. So Forbes hears about this, as we're roping into Forbes. Forbes hears about this, and he says, well, I hear that the kid has some skill. This is kind of almost mirroring what happened with Braddock a little bit. He says, I hear the kid has some skill, and it would be a shame to see him go. And then he asks somebody, why don't you invite him onto my campaign? Why don't you invite him onto my expedition? And so this happens. And so Washington starts out being very enthused about this, actually. And he thinks that, well, now he's got somebody who's more receptive than Loudon. And so he writes this very gushy message directly to Forbes, really aggrandizing him and praising him and so forth. The thing is that Forbes famously didn't like to be overly complimented. He was kind of a down-to-earth guy who didn't like flattery, or what he perceived to be flattery. So they got off on a little funny footing there. And then things kind of got worse because this comes to what Forbes is famous for, Forbes Road, something that still is a thing in Pennsylvania. And so basically Forbes wanted to build a road because of, necessity in a way, in terms of trying to get them to where they needed to go. They needed a better road system, he was saying. We need a better road system. We need to be able to take them the way I want to take them in this campaign. We need to build a road. Problem was, you had civilian road building companies, essentially, under different colonial governance, scrapping with each other for who's going to build the road. Forbes gets fed up with them all and essentially is like, no, the army will build the road. This caused some more problems because some people said it was military overreach. It's something that's still debated to this day, especially because Forbes, like, to be fair, all commanders in doing anything like this, used forage and used conscription, and red tape hung up the pay for the conscripts. It wasn't really all his fault, it was just red tape. But suffice to say, people, some of them felt it was high-handed, some of them felt it was forceful, but Forbes, he felt it was necessary. He says, I'm a career man, I'm a military guy, I know what needs to happen in order for us to take this fort. We need this road, and I can't go back and forth with everybody over this.
Okay.
So yeah, Washington is not happy with this because he and his family had invested in one of the road companies, the civilian road companies. So they begin to clash. Washington on this expedition with Forbes, they start to clash. So what essentially happens is that Washington is also going through some trauma from Monongahela. So he's starting to feel like this plan is too similar to that. I don't like it, and I don't like this road thing. So what he ends up doing is communicating, writing letters to some other young officers in the regular army, and in the British regular army now, and some of them even on Forbes' staff, and kind of trying to go behind Forbes' back to write the king. So this is now King George II. And to write him and to essentially say Forbes is too ill to do this project. Forbes, his physical ailments are affecting his mind, and he's not making clear judgments. So he wanted to kind of do this sort of type conspiracy with some of the young officers and so forth. Well, it turns out Forbes finds out about it through one of the officers. He gets wind of the situation, which doesn't help their relationship much. And he ends up sort of sending Washington into a form of Boondocks exile, so to speak, to kind of put some space between them. He's still on the campaign, but there's some space between them. And so there's some bad blood, and Washington will always maintain that he was treated unjustly, whereas Forbes just feels like he was defending himself. So that's yeah.
Okay, so I mean, we've only got 5 minutes left, but
going forward. So basically, Forbes continues with his roads. This is the point that he makes the call, and he's saying we need this road. He compromises a bit with the civilian authorities by saying, okay, look, I'll do less of the road than I originally intended to do. I'll use part of Braddock's road, and then I'll do part of my road. We'll compromise, sort of. So one of the things that, just to switch to Forbes as a person, he had a great deal of determination under intense stress. And also a wonderful sense of humor. He had a very sarcastic sense of humor, even under great, again, strain and stress. And you can read it in his letters and so forth. And he also had a wonderful way of being charismatic, to try to get people to stick with this project despite everything, all of the setbacks, terrible weather, and his health, everything going wrong. So I'm just going to read briefly some bits and pieces about.
Do you want to tell us? Did he meet his maker eventually in combat, or
yes.
did
All
he
right,
die
I'll
of
wrap
an
that
old age? Because
Yes.
we'll need to wrap this up.
Yes, I know. And this is very short quote.
Okay,
But anyway, yeah. So what he ends up doing is he makes it, despite all odds, he gets to Fort Duquesne. He makes it on the road. And the French, once he approaches, blow up the fort and evacuate it. So they take it, and Fort Duquesne becomes Fort Pitt, which becomes the origin point of Pittsburgh, the city in Pennsylvania. So Forbes very shortly afterwards dies of his ailments. So he's one of the first Scots that we've talked about who has not been shot, but he does die of his ailments. So that's what happens there. He patches it up a little bit with Washington toward the end, because Washington felt a bit bad and wrote him essentially. And Forbes says, "You are threatening to come visit me. If you come visit me, I will see you." And so they have this little patch up. But so anyway, so wrapping that up, and then this, yeah.
Can you tell us what's this picture? What's happening in this picture there?
That's the fort being blown up, and he's in a stretcher, because he had to be carried in a stretcher for much of the campaign. And so that is Fort Duquesne. He's writing basically back to report that the fort has finally been taken, and all of the sacrifices made and all of the deaths that were incurred on Braddock's march and his own have meant something. Britain has taken the fort, the Union Jack has been raised. So that's essentially what's going on there. And then, in very brief, these are just a few excerpts either from Forbes, so this is from Forbes to his men. This is a rousing speech that he gave to try to keep them going with it, really. It says, and he talks about himself in third person with it. The general, therefore, with great confidence, depends upon the men's alacrity and steadiness in carrying on the rest of the service, that we may show our enemies the danger of rousing Britons fired and animated with love of their king and country. And the next bit is something from a chaplain who was talking about when Forbes was brought in to see his men after he'd been carried by stretcher. And there was a great satisfaction and pleasure appeared in his countenance upon finding himself at Raystown with his troops. The robes were crowded with people to see him, whom he saluted with a smile as he passed along, and they in their turn discovered a secret joy upon seeing him. And so then he goes to dinner with him, and he says he's, in spite of being very, very ill, he puts on a face, invites him to dinner, and says, you know, he is very facetious and in high spirits at table, though extremely weak and in low health. And he inquired much into the moral state of the army and declared he was concerned at not being able to attend divine service. He was basically a pious Presbyterian, much like his cousin Duncan Forbes. This was this was honestly maybe a summation of it. John Forbes was a man very dedicated to duty. He had a simple but a strong sense of duty to his country, to his king, to his God. And that was what really formed his life. And then this is the very end, which is his obituary. And it says of him, he made a willing sacrifice of his life to what he valued more, the interest of his king and country. As a man, he was just and without prejudices, brave without ostentation, uncommonly warm in friendship and incapable of flattery, acquainted with the world and mankind. He was well bred, but absolutely impatient of formality and affectation. Eminently possessed of the sociable virtues, he indulged a cheerful gratification, but quick in his sense of honor and duty, so mixed the agreeable gentleman and the man of business together as to shine alike in both characters, without the giddiness sometimes attendant on the one or the sourness of the other. So that is the obituary, and yeah, in a way, I guess I would say that. Ironically, I would say his story does kind of fit in Ash Wednesday context, because it is kind of a memento mori story that, you know, in spite of dealing with a mortal illness, he remained true to his, again, obligations, true to his duties, true to his faith. And I mean, that's, I think, a good way to live and indeed seal your life.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, it's a kind of common theme running among all the soldiers that you have highlighted from Scotland, is this sense of duty.
Oh, yes.
Sense of loyalty to the king, sense of responsibility to the troops, all of that sort of thing, you know, very, very strongly held, certainly back then when the world was
the world was more aware in a way. It was more aware of fundamentals, I think, the fundamentals of what made a hero. To be honest, a hero is one who sacrifices of themselves.
Yes. Well, you have written a book, a kind of a historical fiction around this, around the themes that animate you. It's called All Ye That Pass By. And anybody who's interested in historical fiction, is all you need to do is search Amazon for All Ye That Pass By, and
those interested in those interested in 18th century British military figures from both the French and Indian War and the American Revolution probably find it interesting, because a lot of them do feature in it, and it's the first book of a trilogy, so working on the other two gradually.
Good. Well,
gradually, like Forbes on his road.
Yes, absolutely. Avellina, it's the top of the hour. Thanks very much for coming in, and thanks very much for that very comprehensive, I should say, description of the man from birth to death.
Yeah.
And what's important for us is that that people know that such people exist, because today American history is really just heard post-revolutionary period. But of course, there was a whole time of British America, which
absolutely
was prior to then, and
and it's still in our cultural bloodstream. Is absolutely still in our cultural bloodstream. I've said it in the past, but when I talk about these figures, I don't consider it as talking about foreigners. I consider it talking about we were all one people at one point.
Yes.
And that's something that is important to remember. So these people are just as much a part of my heritage as yours.
Absolutely, 100%. What a great attitude you've got there, Avellina. Good. Well, no doubt you'll find another person, and when you do,
I'll do Sir Peter Halkett, because he's in both. I'll do the Halketts, the Halkett family. They're in both campaigns, Braddock and Forbes. I'll do that next time.
Absolutely. We'll be happy to hear it anytime. Good. So it just remains for me to say all the best to you on this.
Thank you.
Ash
Have
Wednesday.
a blessed Lent. Yes.
And have a great Lent. Okay. Good night. Fantastic. That's Avellina Balestri, who you can find at youtube.com/at Avellina Balestri, and a great friend of Force for Good. And we're very grateful for her work and for everything that she does. Great stuff. Good. Okay. Well, in the last couple of minutes, I just want to do a little punt. I just want to push our mugs, AFFG mugs. We've got a selection of mugs at that address, but we've got a shorter address. We've got a tiny URL address. There you go, tinyurl.com/477 NVAWA. And that's one of the mugs. That's me with a flag, and that's Loch Lomond in the background. And we've got some pictures there of the mugs. So not only do you get the Union Jack at Loch Lomond, we've got the Union Jack at the Kelpies, we've got British Together, Royal Scots, Scottish and British, British Ulster, A Force for Good, British and Proud, and each of these mugs comes in different colours as well. So it's really a very good selection there. And okay, there's another picture of some mugs that we'll put up. There's a British and Proud ones in AFFG red, white, and blue. They're very colourful. They're very colourful, and they look good, and they're a great talking point, and they're as reasonably priced as we can possibly manage, folks. So please do check them out at tinyurl.com/477 NVAWA, or directly below the YouTube video, you'll see a merchandise banner, and you'll be able to scroll along it and click on the buttons there, where you'll also see the mugs. That's just directly below us. Okay. Good. Now, I also ask as well, please do consider purchasing this. Now, we're working on volume 2. The best way to support us is to buy this. You get this from Amazon, and it's all you need to do is just go onto Amazon and search for One Big Country, and this will be the first that comes up, because it's such a great title. Such a great title. Absolutely. Let's get the One Big Country banner up here. There we go. And also our wee book for the Union, which you get at our shop. These are what keep us going, and they're what allow me to spend time researching all this stuff that that we need to research and get out there, that's very difficult to find, and that nobody's really going to find unless somebody is able to do it for them. And so our book, it's taken longer than expected because it's such a big issue, and we keep uncovering stuff that is just absurd. The generosity of this country, the unnecessary generosity, the money that we throw at people who come here, and we get very little back in return. It's just unbelievable, and you wonder how we ever got to this situation. That's another issue for another time. But look, folks, it's the top of the hour. Thanks very much for your comments. There seems to have been a little bit of a problem on YouTube and Twitter at one particular point, although on Facebook apparently it was working fine. Sorry about that, but we'll... Christopher says, thanks, Avellina, as does Oksana. And Ben says, fascinating stuff. Thanks for the education. Thanks for your comment. World Fun says, A Force for Good is super amazing, amazing, amazing. Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Catherine says, so very interesting. Thanks, Avellina. World Fun says, Avellina is amazing. Great stuff. Folks, we'll be back next Wednesday if the good Lord's willing and the creek don't rise. And so until then, it just remains for me to say, God bless the United Kingdom and God save the King. See you next time.